Okay, so you want to own an oil refinery? The pitch sounds incredible on paper. Buy crude oil at the wellhead, run it through a few pipes and furnaces, and out comes gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, heating oil, and a dozen other products that the entire industrial world cannot function without. You're not selling a niche product to a niche market. You're selling the fuel that moves every truck on every highway, every plane, in every sky, and every ship on every ocean. Global demand for refined petroleum products runs around 100 million barrels per day. That is not a market. That is a dependency. Here's what nobody tells you. The difference between the price of crude oil going in and the price of refined products coming out is called the crack spread. On a good day, in a favourable market, that spread runs around $20 to $30 per barrel. On a bad day, it collapses to single digits. And a refinery's entire economic existence sits inside that spread. You do not set the price of crude. You do not set the price of gasoline. You are a processor caught between two commodity markets you have almost no control over. The entire edifice of $1 billion industrial facility exists to capture a margin that can evaporate in a month. Let's start with what it actually costs to get in. A small, simple refinery processing 50,000 barrels of crude per day costs between $500 million and $1 billion to build from scratch. A mid-sized operation running 150,000 barrels per day runs $3 to $5 billion. A large complex refinery, the kind that processes heavy, sour crude into high-value products, costs $10 billion or more. The last major greenfield refinery built in the United States was in 1977. There has not been a new one since, not because the industry stopped needing them, because nobody can justify the capital, the permitting timeline, or the regulatory exposure required to build one in the current environment. When people talk about refineries, they talk about complexity, and complexity in this industry has a very specific meaning. The Nelson Complexity Index measures how sophisticated a refinery is at converting low-value feedstocks into high-value products. A simple distillation-only refinery has a complexity score around 2. A complex refinery with cracking, coking, and desulfurization units runs 12 to 15. The most complex facilities in the world, like ExxonMobil's Beaumont refinery in Texas or Saudi Aramco's Motiva Port Arthur facility, the largest refinery in the United States at 600,000 barrels per day, score above 13. Complexity costs money to build, but it also earns money to run. A high complexity refinery can process cheap, heavy, sulfur-laden crude from Venezuela or Canada's oil sands and turn it into the same premium gasoline a simple refinery produces from expensive, light sweet crude. The margin difference between running heavy crude and light crude can be $5 to $15 per barrel. At 500,000 barrels a day, that is $2.5 to $7.5 million per day. The math on complexity investment is not subtle. Now, the question that actually matters, where does the money come from? And more importantly, where does it go? 4 cost categories define the economics of refining, and almost none of them are controllable. Cost 1, crude oil. This is 80 to 90% of a refinery's total operating cost. Everything else is a rounding error by comparison. The refinery does not produce crude. It buys crude every day in enormous quantities. A 300,000 barrel per day. Refinery is purchasing roughly $24 million worth of crude oil at $80 per barrel every single day. That is $8.7 billion per year, before you've paid a single employee, fired a single furnace, or maintained a single pipe. The refinery lives and dies on the spread between what it pays for crude and what it receives for products. When crude prices spike suddenly, the refinery has already purchased crude at lower prices sitting in its tanks, which is actually a short-term benefit. When crude prices fall suddenly, those same tanks full of expensive crude become a liability. The inventory accounting alone at a large refinery is a financial instrument as complex as anything on Wall Street. Cost 2. Energy. A refinery is one of the most energy-intensive industrial operations on Earth. The process of heating crude oil, separating it into fractions, cracking heavy molecules into lighter ones, and treating sulfur compounds requires enormous amounts of heat and power. A large refinery consumes as much electricity as a mid-sized American city. It also burns significant quantities of its own production as fuel, a concept called refinery fuel use, which typically runs 6 to 10% of total crude input. You are literally burning some of what you make in order to make the rest of it. Energy costs represent 10 to 15% of a refinery's controllable operating expenses, and when natural gas prices spike, as they did in 2022, the economics of the entire operation shift dramatically. Cost 3. Maintenance and turnaround. A refinery never sleeps. The equipment runs continuously, often for years at a time, but periodically units must be shut down completely for inspection, cleaning and maintenance. These shutdowns are called turnarounds. A major turnaround at a complex refinery takes 30 to 60 days, deploys thousands of contract workers, and costs $100 million to $300 million. It is not optional. The equipment degrades, the regulatory inspections are mandatory, and while the refinery is shut down, it is processing zero crude, generating zero margin, and spending enormous amounts of money. The industry plans these events years in advance because a single large-scale turnaround can swing a refinery's annual profitability by hundreds of millions of dollars. Cost 4. Environmental compliance. This is the cost that has reshaped the entire US refining industry over the past 40 years. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, EPA fuel quality standards, state-level emissions requirements in California that differ from federal standards and apply to any fuel sold in that market. Each regulatory change requires capital investment at every affected facility. The shift to low-sulfur diesel in the 2000s cost the US refining industry an estimated $8 billion in aggregate capital spending. The transition to tier-free, low-sulfur gasoline in the 2000s cost billions more. Compliance is not a one-time cost. It is a permanent capital obligation attached to the license to operate. So who actually makes money in this business? The answer is complicated and counterintuitive. In 2022, US refiners posted the highest profits in the history of the industry. Valero, the largest independent refiner in the country, earned $11.5 billion in net income. Marathon Petroleum earned $14.5 billion. Phillips, 66, earned $11 billion. These numbers sound absurd until you understand what happened. Russia invaded Ukraine. European refineries that had been processing Russian crude suddenly couldn't. Global refined product supply dropped. Crack spreads exploded. Refineries that had survived years of thin margins suddenly found themselves capturing $40, $50, even $60 per barrel in some markets. In 1 year, the industry earned back a decade of suppressed returns. Then, 2023 arrived. Crack spreads normalised, margins compressed. Valero's net income fell from $11.5 billion to $8.8 billion. Still excellent by any historical standard. But the direction was clear. The refining business is cyclical in a way that makes the hotel industry look stable. Boom years fund the capital investments required to survive the lean years. The lean years test whether you made the right investments during the boom. The companies that manage this cycle, well, Valero, Marathon, MPC, have survived because they combined operational efficiency, geographic diversification, and balance sheet discipline. The ones that got the cycle wrong are no longer independent companies. Now, let's talk about what is sitting underneath the refinery that nobody wants to discuss: environmental liability, Every refinery in the United States sits on decades of contamination. Hydrocarbons spilled during loading operations, processed water discharged before modern treatment standards existed, leaking underground pipes carrying crude and product through the facility, heavy metals deposited from catalytic processes. A refinery that has been operating since 1950 has 75 years of industrial history embedded in its soil and groundwater. The EPA's Superfund list includes dozens of former and current refinery sites. Cleanup costs at contaminated refinery properties range from tens of millions to over $1 billion. The liability follows the property. When Frontier Oil sold its Cheyenne, Wyoming refinery, the environmental remediation obligations were a central negotiating point in the transaction. When you acquire a refinery, you are acquiring its history. Every pipe that ever leaked, every pond that ever overflowed, every drum that was ever buried on the back acre of the property is now your problem. There is also the staffing reality that does not appear in any financial model. A mid-sized refinery employs 800 to 1,500 people on a permanent basis. These are not retail workers or administrative staff. They are process operators, instrumentation technicians, mechanical engineers, safety inspectors, environmental compliance specialists. The training timeline for a refinery operator runs 3 to 5 years before they can work independently on process units. The institutional knowledge embedded in a refinery workforce is irreplaceable in any reasonable time frame. When BP's Texas City refinery exploded in 2005, killing 15 workers and injuring 180 others, the investigation found that years of cost-cutting, deferred maintenance, and eroded safety culture had created conditions that made the explosion almost inevitable. The human cost was catastrophic. The financial cost, including the $21 billion in total fines, settlements, and remediation costs that BP ultimately paid across its various US operations, was existential for the company's American business. Step back for a second. The refinery business is uniquely brutal because the inputs are a global commodity, the outputs are a global commodity, and you are a price taker on both sides. Every other manufacturer can negotiate pricing. A steel mill can choose which customers to serve, and at what price. A chemical plant can pursue specialty products with higher margins. A refinery's primary products, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, are fungible. They trade on exchanges. The customer doesn't care which refinery made the diesel in their tank. They care about price and availability. Your entire competitive advantage comes down to cost structure. Who runs cheaper? Who processes heavier crude? Who has the most efficient energy use? Who has the best logistics, the closest ports, the shortest pipeline distances to their markets? 2 scenarios, real numbers. Scenario 1. A small 50,000 barrel per day simple refinery. Annual crude cost at $80 per barrel, $1.46 billion. Crack spread of $15 per barrel generates $274 million in gross margin. Operating costs eat $150 to $200 million. Net margin before taxes and debt service, $74 to $124 million on $1.5 billion in facility value. In a down cycle, when crack spreads fall to $8 per barrel, that same refinery earns $146 million in gross margin, barely covering operating costs. You are not building wealth during those years, you are surviving. Scenario 2. A 300,000 barrel per day complex refinery with a Nelson complexity of 12. Annual crude cost, roughly $8.7 billion. Crack spread advantage from processing heavy crude adds $5 per barrel in additional margin. Total gross margin potential in a normal market, $2 to $3 billion. Operating costs run $800 million to $1.2 billion. Net margin in a good year, $800 million to $1.5 billion. Net margin in a bad year, $200 to $400 million. In the worst cycle, 2020, when COVID collapsed, transportation demand globally and jet fuel consumption fell 60% in 90 days. Some refineries ran below cash cost of production for months. They kept running anyway because the cost of shutting down and restarting is itself hundreds of millions of dollars. The refinery business has no idle mode. And then there is the longest term problem of all, the energy transition. Gasoline demand in the United States peaked around 2018. The EIA projects it will decline 20 to 30% by 2035 as electric vehicles penetrate the market. Jet fuel demand, the highest margin product in the refinery barrel, is under pressure from sustainable aviation fuel mandates. Diesel demand is more durable, but electrification of commercial trucking is accelerating. The refineries that survive this transition will not do so by continuing to process crude oil unchanged. The ones already moving are investing in renewable diesel produced from vegetable oils and animal fats, which can run through modified refinery equipment and qualifies for substantial federal subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act. Valero, Diamond Green, Diesel and Phillips 66 have already committed billions to renewable diesel capacity. The playbook is to use existing refinery infrastructure, existing logistics networks, and existing workforces to process different feedstocks for the same markets. The challenge is that the feedstock economics for renewable diesel are as volatile as crude oil, and the subsidy environment can change with each election cycle. The refinery business will not end quickly. The infrastructure is too embedded, the capital is too long-lived, and the world's industrial systems are too dependent on liquid fuels to transition in a decade. But the direction of the long-term demand curve is not ambiguous. In 1981, a refinery engineer named Jean Gaulin joined Ultramar, a small refining company with a single facility in Quebec. He spent the next 2 decades making operational decisions that most of his peers considered overly conservative. Heavy investment in complexity, disciplined crude purchasing, relentless maintenance spending when competitors were deferring it. When the Canadian refining industry consolidated in the 1990s, Ultramar was the company doing the acquiring. When Gaulin eventually led Ultramar Diamond Shamrock through a merger with Valero in 2001, the company he had built was worth $6 billion. He understood that in a business where you have no control over what you buy or what you sell, the only variable you actually control is how efficiently you convert one into the other. The refinery is the most expensive, most regulated, most environmentally complex, and most operationally demanding business in the world. The crack spread will make you rich in good years and test your liquidity in bad ones. The environmental liability beneath your feet was created before you arrived and will outlast any business plan you write. The energy transition is not a distant threat. It is already reshaping the product slate that a viable refinery must be able to produce. The margin is not in the crude. It never was. The margin is in complexity, in efficiency, in the ability to run a facility that has not changed its basic chemistry in 100 years, with enough operational discipline to survive every cycle the market throws at it until the next boom arrives. The ones who understood that are still refining. The ones who didn't are Superfund sites with a chain link fence around them.